Hello modelers and welcome to Modeling from Zero, a video series by AK Interactive. In today's video, we'll show you some techniques that have never been seen on camera before, so definitely don't miss out. Today, we'll be working on the tracks and the lower hull of our Sherman. So, without further ado, let's get to it. So, we're back in the studio, and as we said before, in this video we'll be working on the tracks of our tank. The tracks are definitely one of the hardest parts to work on. Firstly, because of the material. The plastic is flexible and this makes it hard to achieve an adequate adherence for the paint. And secondly, it can be a bit complicated to achieve consistency and make this piece of plastic appear realistic, as by their nature we're talking about parts that have a lot of friction and suffer a lot of wear and tear. Before getting to work, it's recommended to wash the parts with warm water and some soap. This way we get rid of grease and dirt and obtain better results when it comes to adherence. It's also convenient to remove burr and any plastic excess that we can find. And for this, we'll use the trusty plier cutting tool. Once we're finished with the preparation, we'll start the paint process and we'll prime the tracks using black microfill paint. The advantage of this paint is its great resistance, and once the paint dries, we'll be able to handle the tracks with no problem. And as you can see, we're using an airbrush to prime the parts with the paint undiluted directly from the bottle. We need to be very careful at this point and make sure to cover the surface of the tracks completely. We also must let the paint dry before turning the pieces over and priming the other sides. While the tracks are drying, we can work on the small details that we still have pending on the Sherman. If you recall, in one of the previous episodes, we glued the hatches using just a small dot of regular white glue. Now you can see the advantage of that little trick, as we can remove the hatches easily. After we've carefully removed the hatches, it will be the time to look for the respective periscopes. A good way to make sure they fit correctly is to do the dry fit before grabbing the glue. And once we know the fit is good, we'll paint the back side of the periscope using black 3rd generation acrylic paint. It's important to paint the part before placing it, as this way we avoid painting over something that we have already finished and damage the results from the chipping process. When working with superglues, it's a good practice to put some on a surface where we can easily get it from, like this piece of cork. Then, when we have the part in place, we use the toothpick or a small wooden stick to place just a couple of small dots of the glue in the area of the union. You can see that we've painted the back side of the periscope, leaving the front looking like glass, which gives it a more realistic look. Let's now continue with a small trick. Often, we paint the union of the different parts, which makes the plastic glue not work as well. So the trick consists of cleaning a small area of the paint using the extra thin cement. You can see that the glue attacks the paint, and so we'll use the small brush that the bottle comes with, and perhaps another synthetic brush to avoid damaging the glue brush. And this way we can clean the area of the union and make sure that the glue will be as effective as possible. Next, we'll be using dry matte. And with this product, we'll start working on the lower part of the vehicle. If you're wondering about the order in which we should apply the different tones of matte, just think that dry matte is the one that has been in contact with the tank the longest, and therefore it's more reasonable to apply it first so that it's in direct contact with the tank's chassis. Moreover, unlike the wet mat, the tone of the dry mat is typically much lighter. As you can see, we're applying the product with the help of a synthetic brush, and we're applying it over the lower hull, trying not to repeat the pattern. Once we've done this, and using the airbrush, we'll make some splashes. We're taking advantage of the product being still wet, and we shape it with the airbrush. This creates a totally random effect and makes the mud extend all over the surface. The effect we can achieve this way is much more realistic than if we were to apply the product just with the brush. If we're not happy with the result in some area, we can remove the paint that's not dry yet with a clean and wet brush. Using the airbrush to splash the dry mat over the hull gave it a more textured look, and so we'll continue applying it over the rest of the tank. And in the next step, we'll repeat the same process using stirred earth. The application method will be similar to what we did before, and once we have applied the product over the tank, without covering the previous layer completely, we'll use the airbrush to kind of melt them together. It's important to do this while the paint is still wet. If we don't want the layer to be too thick, we can always dilute a bit of the product with some water. This process may seem long and tedious, but in reality you can finish the lower part of the tank in about half an hour. And with just two products, we have made our tank look like if it just came out of a battle in the French bocage. Don't worry to push this effect a bit further than what you'd consider appropriate, as once we add the tracks and the wheels of the tank, the mud won't be as visible. So with this in mind, in this case more is more, and it's better to exaggerate a little bit. Now we'll start working on the actual tracks. We have respected the time they need to dry, and this way we achieved a very resistant layer of paint. So the next step will be painting the tracks with rubber black. The tone is a great starting point, as it imitates the color of rubber perfectly. This kind of acrylic paint dries very quickly, so once we have applied the paint, we can move on to the next color almost immediately. And here comes the difficult part. We have diluted the gunmetal paint. The ratio is approximately 10% water and 90% paint. And now we'll paint the metal parts of the tracks. To make sure that the metallic paint gives us the best results possible, a good practice is not to paint over the same area several times, at least not when the paint is still wet. If we do want to paint over the same spot, it's best to wait until it dries completely. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to metallic paint is that because of its formula, it can destroy natural brushes. like the one we're using here, so be sure to use one that is older than what you would typically use. When using this product, you should also make sure to clean your brush more frequently, as a way to prevent the paint from drying on the brush, since this could damage the bristles that are still in good condition. And after the hard work of painting all the metal parts one by one, we'll create our own black wash to give the metal more depth and contrast so that it can look more realistic. To do so, we'll mix black paint with acrylic thinner. You could use water instead, but in our case we've preferred using thinner as we believe it respects the formula of the paint better and it makes it easier to work with. We've switched the brush and we're now using the one from before to apply this wash all over the metal parts. The idea is not to paint all that's supposed to be metal in black, but rather give it a darker appearance and remove some of the shine. If you use too much paint, no worry, you can remove it. And now we'll move on to liquid pigments, in this case dark rust dust. We'll use the same technique as before and apply this pigment as if it were a wash all over the metal parts. If you do paint over some part of the rubber, that's fine. You have two options. Either you can clean it with the thinner now, or cover it up in the next steps. The trick to have a realistic looking rust effect is to apply the product in an irregular way. Keep in mind that not everything should look like it has the same amount of rust, or have it in the same spots. Here you can see that we're using a clean brush with some thinner to remove the excess of rust from the chains. Don't panic if the liquid stains some of the surrounding areas, that's normal. The thinner reactivates the pigments and allows us to work with them for much longer. And now we're taking advantage of the pigment we've applied before, the dark rust, still being fresh, and we'll add some light rust dust to create more irregular rust patterns. In this case, we've diluted the pigment more as it's a brighter color, so we don't want it to stand out too much. At this point, it's a good idea to wait for this first layer of liquid pigment to dry completely, and then revise our work and correct any errors that we may have made. We notice that the rust pattern does seem quite regular, so we'll add some small layers of the lighter rust. And here is the result of the first phase. What do you think? Next, we'll use a mixture of 3 pigments to create dust and dirt effects: light soil, desert dust, and medium earth. We're applying this mixture over the central part of the track, and we'll also let it cover the metal parts that we've previously applied the rust to integrate it with the rest of the track. As you can see, the key here is not the order in which we apply the pigments, but instead to integrate them together so that we can achieve a realistic result. Another important thing to keep in mind is the movement of the brush. Notice how we're moving it forward and backward to leave the pigment only in the deepest parts of the tracks and have only small marks on the most raised areas. And the same can be said for the lower parts, the area where the tracks meet the ground. We'll apply the pigments in the deeper spots and let the product gather there. And then we start to remove most of the pigment with forward and backward movement of the brush from the area that has been in contact with the ground. When working on the other track, we must keep in mind to work towards achieving similar results. It wouldn't make sense to add more color on one side and make each one of the tracks look different, as these elements work together for the majority of their lives, and therefore they should be in similar condition. On a side note, we would like to point out how relatively clean our workspace looks when compared to what it would look like if we were using traditional pigments, as opposed to the liquid pigments we are using in this project. And since we have already prepared the mixtures, we can take advantage of them and also use them on the lower side of the hull and simulate some dust there. We'll now start working on the road wheels, trying to keep the rubber parts as clean as possible. This is where the most friction would be, and therefore the dirt would mostly rub off, leaving the area looking cleaner than the rest. This part of the work can be more tedious because it's repetitive, but once the product has dried and our tank is completely assembled, we assure you that the results of the time we have spent on this painting process will be very gratifying. So, if you've gotten to this point on your own models, take it slow, remain patient, and you'll see how the results are very much worth it. When the pigment is dry and we can handle the parts without worrying about damaging them, it will be the moment to glue the road wheels to the tank's chassis. And to do so, we'll use super glue. By using this kind of glue, if something goes wrong, it will be easier to separate the pieces. However, we all know that the disadvantage of the super glue is that we must work quickly and with precision, since the glue dries almost immediately when in contact with another surface. And now that we've successfully attached the first track, we'll trust in our ability to repeat the process with the other one. We'll now show you the procedure that we followed. As you can see, we have unglued the interior parts of the suspension, and this will allow us to fit the track more easily. We'll add a drop of super glue to the union, and using the pliers we'll apply pressure until it's completely dry. Then we'll place the idler wheel and the drive sprocket inside the track in the position where they would be in real life. Afterwards, we'll slowly and without applying too much pressure get them in the correct position. Don't worry if the suspension's placement is somewhat unnatural. We can apply some pressure against the ground and it'll find its position automatically. Then we can add some sensation of weight and gravity by joining the tracks with the superior part of the suspension. This will create some curves that will make the track look like it really has some weight. So, modelers, this has been the second to last episode of the Modeling from Zero series. What do you think about the result of the tracks? If you liked the video, be sure to share it and leave a comment in the comment section below, and we'll see you in the last episode. Well, modelers, I hope you liked this video and also the products and techniques we've shown you today. We recommend that you don't miss out on the last episode of Modeling from Zero, as we still have some things to learn and discover. Thank you for staying with us until the end, and I'll see you the next time.